Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Hello and welcome. Just a quick reminder that we are recording today's session and it will be available afterwards. For those of you who don't know me or I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Laura Hillier and I am EMEA Marketing Director for Bullhorn. I'm incredibly excited to be here again today for what is the best day in the year for us, to present to you and introduce what we hope will be a fascinating few hours spent in the company of incredible women at the top of their game. As you will no doubt be aware, the theme of the recent International Women's Day was Break the Bias. As the impact of the global pandemic and the return to the office has shown, everyone is facing different challenges when it comes to bias in their personal and professional lives. But some universal themes have come out of the massive societal shift over the past 2 years, and they are the need to be courageous and empathetic in the workplace. Today, we have a programme that will enable you to focus on just that, and will leave you with not only knowledge that may help you reassess where you are, but also with actionable insights that you can take forward. In short, we know that you'll leave in a better place than you arrived, and we're very much looking forward to taking you on that journey. First up, I have the incredible honour of introducing our moderator for today, my colleague Indy Massetti. British born, she now lives in the States with her gorgeous young family. She's been in the staffing software space for over 10 years, she truly is an expert, and joined Bullhorn 2 years ago as account specialist for Bullhorn's enterprise clients. She's passionate, as we all are, about women's empowerment, growth, and making a difference. And she's also a great moderator, which is why we picked her. Next up, we've got a panel from all over the world. Sunny Ackerman is a recognised leader in the recruiting industry with over 2 decades of experience spanning a variety of sectors. Before joining S3 as President Americas, she was the Americas President for Frank Recruitment Group. As a leader of S3's second largest territory, she has prioritised gender equality and diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives. Staffing industry analysts listed Sunny in the 2022 North American's 100 of the most influential and bold leaders in the industry, and 3 consecutive times she was named as a Global Power 100 most influential woman in recruiting. Next, we have Barbara Bruno. Barbara joined GI Group back in 2022, yes, 20 years ago, developing her career path with growing responsibility in both the temp and permanent staffing businesses. Starting from her place of birth in Italy, moving into international roles with ever-growing responsibilities across service and operations. And latterly, she was appointed as head of the temp and perm staffing practice at a global level. And like many of us, she's also a mum of 2 small children. Louise Campbell, who's our third panellist, began her recruitment career in 1996. And after a successful career spanning 2 continents, she joined Robert Walters in 2003. Until recently, she held overall responsibility for the Irish operations across all divisions before moving into her current role as Head of Learning and Development. She was recently voted into the top women in global staffing by staffing industry analysts. As you can see, a stellar panel. We're very grateful for them all for giving up their time. Over to you, Indy.
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. And wow, look at us all uniting from different countries and time zones. Isn't this brilliant? Makes me even more excited. And thank you all for joining us in celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. You know, one mission is to forge inclusive work cultures where women's careers thrive and our achievements are celebrated. Gosh, it feels like International Women's Day is more important than ever after the past 2 years. And today I do have the pleasure of joining these amazing women who are leaders in the recruitment industry to have a discussion on this year's theme, Break the Bias. We've got so much to cover today, so I'm just going to go straight into it. You know, bias is not universal. So I'd like to hear from each of you, what does breaking the bias mean to you? And how do you discuss bias within your organization? And Sunny, if you could lead us with that, please.
Thank you, Indy, and welcome everyone, and happy Equal Pay Day for our US colleagues. Today is what we call Equal Pay Day, and I think that's something that we all should be looking to celebrate. I think the term breaking the bias, the one thing I hear really loud and clear is action. And when I think about it, one of the things that resonate with me is calling it out. If you really do care about breaking the bias, I think one of the most practical and valuable actions you can take is to call it out at the moment. When you hear or see gender bias, if you recognize it, discrimination or any kind of stereotyping, and say nothing, know in those moments that your silence gives consent, and don't consent, call it out. And then lastly, challenge default assumptions. I mean, I think this has been an interesting one for me. So notice the first thing that comes to mind when you hear everyday terms like leadership or talent or potential. I think one of the ways that bias is maintained is through unquestioned assumptions. And this can lead to sometimes what we call confirmation bias, which is when we make assumptions and then instead of being truly objective, we simply see what we're looking for, what we expect to see. So an example, an interesting one is that in retail clothing, slogans for girls and boys showing radically different assumptions. For girls, you'll see be kind and happy, and boys, you'll see strong warrior for boys. Those kinds of language and those different types of slogans can have real impact in maintaining gender-based assumptions in the future. So looking at those things and challenging sometimes those default assumptions is another way.
Well, I think Sunny is really right. I mean, the first point, I think it's recognizing that bias is there. And this is not really easy, not always at least. I'm thinking about our environment, for example. I think in the European countries, it's a slightly different situation than in the US, where probably you are a bit ahead of this, let's say, rather than we are. So in our case, I think really the most relevant point is recognizing that either you or someone else is facing a bias, and then to support, to call it out and to spot it clearly. So that's really the starting point. I agree, Sunny.
Feel the same, Louise?
And Indy, yeah, hi Indy, thanks for having me here today. I think when I think of the term breaking the bias, I love the phrase. For me, it encapsulates the whole gamut of biases that exist in the workplace and the need to extend beyond just that singular approach for say women, for example. I think it's not about one particular group of people. It goes much further than a gender barrier to me, to much more of a multifaceted reality, which really can't be overlooked. In my opinion, we cannot prioritize certain groups of individuals for inclusion. There's no one group, for example, women, that is any more or less than important than any other. There's so many biases out there that need to be broken. And I think thankfully now, conversations like this and the past couple of years, people are now more open to discussing this topic. And there's been a lot of conversations this year about accepting the fact that we all have our own ingrained bias, whether we like to admit it or not. And I think a large part of driving change is recognizing this. And as Sunny and Barbara have said, challenging not only our own behaviors, but the behaviors and the culture of organizations, and driving a more formal approach to change in the work environment.
100% agree with you, Louise. And, one universal theme, as Laura had mentioned earlier, to come out of this massive societal shift over the past 2 years is the need to be courageous and empathetic. I find myself in situations every day or every week where I'm stepping out of my comfort zone to be courageous, and hosting this webinar is one of them. Can you share a practical example of overcoming obstacles that you faced, and what advice would you give to be more courageous? Louise, could you start us off with a journey that you've experienced?
I can, Indy. Yeah, I'm more than happy to. I think, for me, being courageous and it's a very personal story, and I would realize it's not the same for everybody. But for me, I would regularly evaluate the value that I bring to the workplace. It's probably my biggest driver in terms of my motivation. Am I making an impact? I've been in the same role for the past 20 years as managing director of the Irish business. And Ireland, you know, being an MD in Ireland over the past 20 years has given me huge highs and lows, from the Celtic Tiger growth to the financial and housing crisis of 2008 and beyond. And then obviously we've had COVID for the past number of years. I still felt coming out of COVID the need to be doing something different. And obviously I've recently moved into the head of learning and development for the business. I have totally changed jobs. I'm now in a group function where my previous peers who I worked alongside are now my stakeholders. And I'm now responsible for providing a service to them and their workforce. So that's a massive shift for me. There's loads of challenges along the way. I mean, when I think of being courageous, I do think, oh my God, I'm 47 years of age. I have 2 children. I had a job for 20 years that I was in control of and that I could do with relative ease and you know, little stress. And now I've just thrown myself into a job where I'm feeling totally out of control at various different points in time. And I think that imposter syndrome comes back again. So there's a small part of me from a personal perspective that thinks, am I mad to make a career change at this stage in my life? Then again, I thought, you know, without sounding too deep, what do I want my legacy to be? Am I still going to add the same value in the next 10, 15 years as I've done in the last 15 years? Can I actually learn something new? And the thought of it, you know, it's a bit terrifying, I'll be honest with you, but at the same time, it's a really exciting prospect to challenge yourself continuously. And I think personally, I got quite comfortable and I've now thrown myself back out there. So let's talk again in 6 months and see how I'm going.
Incredibly inspiring, really is.
Or mad, one or the other.
Inspiring.
Yes, it is. Louise, I like the way you are, so open and authentic about your experience, and how did you feel when you had this opportunity, right?
Oh, thank you, Barbara. It is rather frightening, I think, and for anyone who's on the call, who's listening, you know, who's been in the same job for 20 years. I think so many people are feeling this way post-pandemic as well, whether or not maybe there's something else out there, maybe there's a new challenge. And I think the last 2 years have been about survival for so many people, that it's quite nice to be in a position now where there's options.
Of course.
Yeah.
Annie, you have a story also to share with us about being courageous.
Yeah, thank you, Indy. Louise, great story. And I applaud you, because it does take, I think sometimes those courageous steps in our career, we get so comfortable, things that we do, to step out and do something different. So I applaud you for it.
Thank you.
And you're going to be wildly successful, I know it. So, but yeah, this is an interesting one for me. And I recently posted about this very topic, and I shared it as I came back into this new position that I'm in with S3. It was one that I didn't share with a lot of people, but then I started sharing it actually, and people really kind of were drawn to this topic of being courageous and empathetic. And so one of the things that's kind of, I took some time off in 2020 to care for a loved one. And it was a bit of an unplanned career break for me. I've worked kind of nonstop since the age of 16, definitely never anticipated taking a career break, but needed to at that point in life for a family member. And it was interesting. I think one of the things that's fascinating is, and I've done a bit more research around this, is like 53 million adults are caregivers, yet 79% of respondents to a recent survey say they don't have access to benefits that would support, these responsibilities and taking time off. So I feel there's a bit of a bias to taking time off. So I think one of the topics around this is being, keep breaking down any stereotypes and biases relates to working parents or parents who take a career break for mat leave, or aging parents. In my example, helping women know their worth and employers to not take that for granted. And it was interesting because reflecting back now, I think it was courageous because, again, it was the right decision for me to do at that point in my life. But I told this story to a colleague of mine in US. I unconsciously, but definitely imposed some, I would say, self-inflicted expect less mentality when I was planning to re-enter the marketplace, because I took time off. And I wasn't, I thought, well, I took time off, this is going to definitely impact my career. And my spouse was actually the one that challenged me and said, why would you think that way? Your skills, your competencies, your experience haven't changed. Why would you not expect what you deserve? So I think the point is, don't get caught in that trap. Talk to your support network. Don't expect less when you decide to re-enter the job market. Be courageous. You are still who you are. and sometimes a brief time out of the market for maternity leave or aging parents or whatever it might be has not necessarily changed anything. And there's still plenty of work to do when it comes to empowering working parents through things like employee benefits. There's far less progress being made when it comes to supporting caregivers. But I think it's a topic that we need to be really kind of speaking more about, because people are pivoting, to Luis's point, and taking different jobs or different careers, or even taking breaks right now. I think a lot of people have gone through the past couple of years and have decided to step out for a bit of time for whatever reason. And I would applaud people that are doing that for whatever reason in their life. It is a courageous step. But know your worth when you come back in, and connect with your network. I had a lot of incredible women that really lifted me up during that process and said, yeah, you're still great as you were, a year taking off, things haven't changed. So just, again, employ your network around you, some powerful women that will help you, and a good spouse, I will say. I'll give him some credit for that.
That is brilliant. And it's always nice to have that reminder. And speaking of your spouse and, our male colleagues as well, I want to ask on their behalf, how can they become better allies for female colleagues and female team members in the organization? Barbara, could I have you kick us off here?
Of course, in fact, I don't like thinking about male colleagues as allies. That's reality. Why? Because I think men, especially in the workplace, they should not try to protect women. They should definitely respect women. That's the main point to me. So either it's women or men, I think we have really the very important point is what we have to bring in terms of value, as Luis was underlining before, how important it is to bring value to the organization and to have this value recognized by the organization. That's a way to empower women. So that's why I don't like to consider men as allies. I think they should simply respect us, consider us as peers. That would be enough. And that would, create the conditions for us to be really empowered.
Great take.
It's interesting. I think, Barbara, we talked about this last week, and we had a bit of a pre-session, and I thought it was an really interesting perspective from you. And I agree. I think that we've got to stand within our own kind of space, but I also think sometimes bringing, and I've seen this trend happen. I started an employee resource group, goodness, probably about 10 years ago at a previous company. And at that time, we actually said no men allowed in the women's ERG at the time. And we were very much, women that, identified as women, and we wanted women to have a safe space in these kind of groups to be able to have that conversation. We started realizing that we needed male allies because organizations, are, still, we know, very, very heavily dominated by, I would say, men and ranks of leadership. So you need men to, I think, understand and also, be responsible for co-creating opportunity and driving accountability and trust. And so, I think having men at those discussions, and it's interesting when you bring them in, all of them are, wanting the best for their, for their children, and whether they have a daughter or their wife, if they have a working spouse or their sister. And so I think when you bring the conversation to light with men and bring them to the conversations and being a part of allies in those discussions, I think it is a very, very powerful stance to take, because more and more you get that engagement, it's going to help us, I think, potentially move the needle. But I agree, women are brilliant. We can stand on our own 2 feet. We don't need men necessarily to help us, but they are still in positions of power. And I think it is something we have to recognize and really bring them into the discussions, which is such an important topic for all of us in breaking the bias.
Yes, Honey, I would agree, and I would agree with you, Barbara. I don't think any woman wants to feel as if we have to be, reliant on a man in the workplace to look after us and help us forge our career. But I do think, I have to say, I had a really interesting conversation with the CEO about 2 or 3 years ago, and I asked him about how they're growing female leaders within the business, because I knew that there was a real issue in this business because no females were getting to that top end of the triangle. And he looked really embarrassed, and he shrugged and he said, well, I don't know why there's no women at the top. We give people exactly the same opportunity to progress. It just so happens that our senior leaders are men. And I think that this is a really common problem that we come across, and, you know, reverts back to Barbara's point about not liking the term ally. We don't need to be looked after, but I really think it's crucial for male leaders to understand the difference between equality in the workplace and equity in the workplace, and the responsibility that all leaders have to create an even playing field. Yes, women might have the same opportunities to progress as men, but we all know that that isn't enough. And, you know, that goes back to my point with breaking the bias. It goes for all marginalized groups, but we need to step in, the leaders, and Sunny, as you said, quite often males in positions of high power, need to step in and see where the stumbling blocks and the pain points are, and sometimes provide that little bit of extra help to get people over the line and get them performing at their best.
Yeah, I agree, Louise. I think that's also connected with the example of Sunny before. I mean, it was a different example, but somehow you said that you were you didn't realize you were finding yourself in a bias, no, about the fact of taking a time off. I think that's very often it's similar. If I think about my experience when I had my first child in 2017, yes. When I had to come back, I had a very challenging role. It was an international position, and I was used to travel on a daily basis. I mean, all across Europe and outside Europe. So I was literally never at home. When I went back from maternity leave, I said, okay, what about now? I should make a step back and change of role, you know, because of course I cannot compete in terms of availability with my colleagues, at least men. And that's what I mean about Sunny's example. I mean, it was my bias. Then I told myself, okay, look, I have the skills to perform my job. I still have them. I have the will. I still have it, even more than before. So what I need to find is the right space for me to, you know, to perform with different conditions, because of course I cannot allow myself in the same working style than before. I cannot allow myself to travel on a daily basis. I need to find a compromise. And then I simply tried to be as authentic as possible. I told my boss, he is the global CEO, look, I'm a mom now, my conditions have changed, my will has not changed, my skills are not. And he told me, okay, I'm a dad, so I can understand you. I said, no, you can't. I mean, you are a dad, I'm a mom. That's a different story, okay? So conditions are actually different. So we have to find a way to make people performing at the best way with their conditions, you know, feeling their needs basically in this. So that's my point of view.
Barbara, you've kind of somewhat answered my next question, which was, you know, although there's still challenges we face in the role we play as being resilient, you know, what actions can we take to progress our careers and also those around us? And one of yours I hear is to speak up. What advice would you give, Louise?
Well, as you've said, I think, you know, the past 2 years, and I just mentioned it earlier, for so many of us has been about survival, and women have typically taken on the role of homeschooler, carer, you know, for elderly parents, working all hours while trying to manage our own internal stress levels. And I think it maybe wasn't the time to be looking at progressing your career. Now we're in the most candidate short market I have ever seen of all time. Staff retention is a top priority for all organizations across the world. And I think that we need to look at the opportunity that this brings. There's never been a better time to put your hand up and ask for the job that you want. You know, whether that's a promotion or a sideways move into an area of the business that you've always felt passionate about. I think, you know, it's really important to not assume that your leaders and your managers know what your career aspirations are, or that they know what the best career path is for you. So I think be really proactive about managing that yourself, because if there was ever a time to move into a different department and try something that you want to do, I guarantee most people on the call that their organizations will do everything they can to retain them now. So it's a great time to be adventurous.
And for those who feel their organizations may lack empathy and are wondering how to shift the culture in their environment, Sunny, what advice would you give? And can you share an example of a cultural shift you have experienced or implemented?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it is clear. I think to Louise's point, one thing that we've learned during the pandemic, it's that business as usual will never be that kind of usual, and we've grown accustomed to. And I think just with the fears and anxieties and concerns that people have been exposed to the past couple of years, you know, I will speak of the current environment that we're in with the Ukraine crisis and the level of fears and anxiety that that's bringing to colleagues worldwide. I mean, it is, you know, from a leadership perspective, empathy is understanding how others are feeling, and empathy begins with vulnerability, and leaders are in the best position to model empathy for their team members, you know, by really speaking openly. And so one of the things that, you know, we're looking to do right now within the organization is we're implementing, it's a bit of our kind of mental well-being plan, and it's being led right now by our senior leadership teams across the organization. So our global general counsel, our CIO, and myself are looking at, you know, part of our people strategy aims at creating kind of a culture where it enables our people to be their best and equipping them with, you know, skills and knowledge to contribute to kind of mental well-being. And so we've been implementing actually different types of sessions around well-being strategy. One of them is, you know, different kind of work procedures in looking at, you know, mental well-being resources, things like Talkspace, you know, providing kind of, you know, different types of options for them around, you know, training that can help them talk to other individuals, professional support, training resources, kind of bite-sized learning. But then, you know, all of those things are great. And we've got actually really nice, you know, I would say participation in people actually taking advantage of some of those resources. But I think as a leader, sometimes it's just pausing and asking your teams how they're doing and maybe how you're feeling. And so as we're still working in this hybrid environment, we are all on these kind of video calls all day. And I think sometimes I've witnessed us just jumping into calls. We've got, you know, usually back-to-back calls, and we get right into like kind of the core of the topic or the objective. And we don't just pause at the beginning of a call and say, how are you doing? How's everyone doing? A lot going on right now in the world, and just holding some space to talk. And we started doing that. I mean, I always kind of try to do that. I'll catch myself going right into the topic of the call, and then I'll pull myself back and go, okay, I need to ask how everyone's doing, because I'm struggling myself right now. And I shared that in a call a couple of weeks ago. I came out of a, you know, getting dressed in the morning, Friday morning, and I was watching what was happening in Ukraine. And I walked into the office that morning for a 7 a.m. call, and I was really struggling. And I just spent the next kind of 3 to 4 hours on video calls, just talking to people. And it was actually quite therapeutic for me, and I think for our teams. But we've got to hold that space for people. If they're not comfortable talking in that environment or in one-to-one or a group setting, it's giving them other options to be able to give them alternatives to have access to. I think it's critically important right now as an organization that leaders do bring that into light and really try to help employees across the world.
Sunny. Barbara, do you have any advice for us?
Yeah, I think Sandy's point on simply asking and chatting about how do you feel, especially when there are crises, is very, very practical and very relevant. From a company perspective, I think we are trying to move very, very strongly towards the implementation of a purpose and our values. I think that's a way to, you know, to feel empathy with the organization, not only between people. That's very important. And I think especially in a context like the Italian one, you know, human relationships are key. So we cannot work without having this. But from a company perspective, I think we focus very much in the last year in defining our purpose even more and making it clear to the whole organization. So 7,000 people, and to make sure they know what are the values and what does it mean to live with this value in the organization. So what does it mean to be cooperational? What does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be, you know, empathetic? That's just examples. And when you think about this, and then you have the Ukrainian crisis, and you have to think about and to discuss with your colleagues, I think, to have in mind what does it mean for a company, an organization to have these values, means also how to translate these into action or, you know, into relationships. So I think that's the way.
you have anything to add to that, Louise?
I'm sitting here nodding because I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, the importance of empathy and leading empathetically has never been more important than it is now. I think, you know, work in the last 2 years has just shown us that it is such a human place with real human relationships, and the role of leadership. And it's not just the responsibility of a HR function, it's the role of all leaders across the board. It's to set the tone from the top. And that is just so important because you know, we in order to get people engaged and performing at their best, we really need to understand how people are doing, and that, you know, we can facilitate a positive change when we are trusted to do so. So we've got a role to play in being very proactive and solutions focused and driving change. And I think, you know, a lesson that we've learned is that a one size fits all approach just doesn't work. It's so much better to talk to your people and to ask for feedback and to understand what people need, you know, and it's like asking a woman of, you know, a newborn baby, what help do they need to come back to the workplace? And then asking somebody who's got grown-up children who've left the home, what support do they need? You know, one size does not fit all. And it's really, I think, we've spent a lot of time talking to our people and having very human conversations about how we can support them. You know, and I think that this is the best way forward. I also think it's really, really important to take time and reflect on lessons learned throughout the last number of years. When were, you know, when was the organization at their best? When were departments at their best? When were we at our best? And what do we need to do to support people to stay at that level? And I think, you know, if we can make that sustainable and you know, have that sort of reflective practice, it can become really powerful.
I would agree with Louise. It's interesting too, Louise. I think the whole notion around, you know, not one size fits all, I think is such an important piece, because people are sometimes struggling in different ways and not really comfortable, you know, being able to speak about it. And I think I know Belinda's kind of our keynote today in the session, and I love her title, Chief Empathy Officer. Her work is brilliant because I think she talks about, to the end game, it's shorter term, it's important to get things first started, and change small things and bigger things can follow. But you know, how empathy must be prioritized and kind of valued throughout the entire organization, and not just, you know, delegated to a different department or HR or whatever it might be. It really is leadership, kind of, you know, role modeling that. But, you know, start small and have some short-term wins, or try things before you do bigger things. I think that's a really important piece, because not all one size fits everyone. So
exactly. And I think the big things won't change overnight as well. They might take time, and a lot of time. So if you're getting quick wins in the meantime, it can really keep you going.
Yeah.
Being human, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the core values I'm very proud to say our organization at Bullhorn has. And Sunny, thanks, because you know, Belinda Palmer will be speaking in more detail about leading with empathy. So stay tuned for that too. Let's look at some key considerations for organizations, more so the role of staffing firm executives and leaderships in new inclusive work models. How have you pivoted to offer an inclusive and flexible working model to suit a vast range of needs and priorities? We can start with Louise.
Sure, no problem. I think, again, it went back to, I mean, to offer that inclusivity and the flexible work model. It goes back to listening to our people, to actually understand what it is that they need. We needed to canvass opinions and ask people about their preferences, and tuning into where people do their best work. Also, and a big part of our role, I think, was being very clear that we have a role to play in paying it forward in terms of supporting our new staff. And some of that experience needs to be face-to-face, built on the culture of teamwork that we have. So that has been an interesting experience for us, because we, you know, what we were doing throughout the pandemic was fine, but we realized that our culture is very much built in Robert Walters upon teamwork and collegiality, and bringing people into the business and training them and having them there immersed in the DNA of our business. And that's really challenging when you have a fully remote and workforce. So, you know, we've spoken to people, and we've come to what we hope is the perfect compromise. But it's really been a case of understanding what's important to people and using this insight to empower managers locally to have their own best approach. And then I think the role of learning and development has been really important throughout the last number of years, because it has supported that pivot too. And it thinks about, I suppose, how we develop and upskill our people managers to tailor their approach. And I know certainly our approach now has become much more about the role of a manager in a coaching capacity. You know, there's no longer the kind of the dictatorial manager of 20 years ago who came in and shook their fist at people and said, do what I want you to do. It's very much a coaching and empathetic culture that we're trying to create and educate our managers on now.
Same, I think, with Louise. We really we actually created like kind of, you know, groups of employees with our kind of support functions and our sales teams. And I think very much like, you know, a lot of the organizations on the call, we were very much in an office 5 days a week, you know, pre-pandemic, you know, everyone had to be kind of, you know, presenteeism, you know, type was a kind of important kind of, you know, notion. Whereas now we've learned a lot about ourselves and how we work best over the past year and how we feel sustainable and which, you know, what benefits we appreciate working remotely and what aspects of being in the office we missed. And so I think it's been really interesting, you know, kind of, we thought about hybrid working, about harnessing this to shake it up and give people more autonomy to decide how and when and where they want to work. So we've gone through through the feedback of the employees, a bit of a pilot hybrid, what we're calling it right now, because we kind of stopped and started like many of us. We opened and then we closed and we opened again and then we closed again with all the different variants. And now we're at a point where we actually have hybrid working for our sales teams, but them deciding when they want to go in and what days. It doesn't have to be 8 to 5. We have core working hours, giving people flexibility on. And we're piloting it. I mean, we're going to look back on this hopefully in 3 or 4 months and see what's working, what's not, and we might change and pivot again. And so we're really trying to take the feedback from the employees. But, you know, there is an important piece, I think, to the cultural aspect of who we are as a business, that we want people coming together and maybe not using the offices the same way they've used it previously, you know, but thinking about it from a coaching, community, and a connectivity perspective. Maybe, you know, they get work done when they're there, but are also utilizing the offices a bit differently. But I think we've allowed some of the flexibility for different parts of our workforce that were really appreciated, like working parents, you know, that want that flexibility to go pick up their kids at 3 p.m. Whereas, you know, 2.5 years ago, that's something maybe was a little bit unheard of in our business. Now it's just like, absolutely, I'm going to take a call. I'm going to be back here in an hour, or even if it's going and working out for an hour in the middle of the day, and then they're back online at 4 o'clock. So those kind of things have really, I think, turned our world upside down in a good way. And I think as employers, we've got to be really looking at that from a work perspective to understand what works for our employees. But also, at the end of the day, we have a business to run, so we've got to think about that too as well. So it's that balancing act, right? So
yes, I think Sunny, we are now more used to, or at least we try to lead by results rather than measuring the effort, you know, especially in terms of presence that each single person can or should bring to the workplace. And I think it's tricky. I agree with what you said, that, I mean, in the past it was, okay, we work in the office, then we go out for a beer all together. Now it's, please, let's meet in the office to have some time together, like having a coffee conversation and so on. That's really brilliant if you think about it from a company perspective, because the workplace can become really an aggregation point rather than, you know, a place where you have to be and sit at your desk and do your work and that's it. And then you go out for nicer things. That's exactly the opposite. It's becoming the opposite. So we meet in the office because we have no limits, let's say, in this moment for a hybrid workforce, or let's say for a smart working and so on. So we meet in the office when we want actually to have the community present, or to exchange things, or to discuss in person, or to simply to spend time together. That's so nicer.
Yeah, agree.
Great advice there. And how can organizational leaders address the anxiety of their employees and the associated levels of burnout that the pandemic and all these changes in the world has brought upon us?
I think one of the areas that we are looking at is getting serious about mental health. We know there's going to be, I think looking more and more, we see mental health issues arising in the news, and sometimes shocking results from people that have been through the past couple of years. And so I think organizations looking at that and knowing that is something that's happening within the work environment with many of our colleagues, and bringing awareness to it, but potentially offering benefits or rewards or different things that through your overall structure that might be able to help employees with that. One of the things that we just reintroduced here in the US was a bit of a sabbatical policy. So we had a bit of an unwritten informal policy, and we just formalized one here in the US market, and we're allowing people at certain tenure to take time off or take breaks. And so I think there's different things that organizations can do, but I think one of the things around, when I think about burnout, it typically results from stress, which can definitely lead to a mental health impact. And so I think as leaders, we need to get serious about mental health in our own businesses, and understanding that impact or ignoring it is not an option as a business with our employment base.
Absolutely, I agree, Sunny. And I think it's one of the things that when I talk to my clients, and even internally as well, I think the benefits packages that we're now offering employees have become so diverse, and it is so centered around mental health and well-being now, because everybody knows it's one of the biggest burning issues for not only a HR department. These issues are no longer, I suppose, just the problems of HR to go and figure out. They're everyone's issues, and we all have a responsibility to do so. But I think by offering a diverse benefits package in the form of better medical care, gym memberships, time out, as you said, sabbaticals when you've been in companies for X amount of years, all of these things are really important to people, and they really matter to people. And again, I think you need to take a pulse check on your organization and see what it is that people want. I remember one person saying to me one day when I was giving out about the fact that nobody had taken me up on some new initiative that I had come up with, and they said, stop giving people more of what they don't want. And it really rung true with me, because there's no point in offering all these things if you're not listening to your people, and if they're not interested in what you have to offer. We have to be able to offer diversity within our offering, whether that be through our benefits or whatever it might be as an employer offering to our staff.
Unfortunately, I'm getting that 3-minute warning to wrap up. But I am going to sneak in one more question. How best can we support women and help find new ways to remain visible for what may remain a hybrid workplace? If you could kick us off, Barbara.
Yes, I think in the it's very important if you are a woman and you want, for example, a career shift, you are considering it. I would really suggest first what I said before, to really be authentic. So bring your needs to the table, speak openly, because that's the first starting point. And second, I think having a mentor, of course, a female mentor in this case, would help a lot. I'm really convinced that women in leadership positions can support each other. The level of competition I see decreasing more and more, and the level of engagement for a real community I see raising more and more. So I think this could be also a good option to make yourself visible to women in leadership, and to ask for tips, advices, supporting relationships and so on.
Yeah, I would agree with Barbara. Oh, go ahead, Louise.
Oh, sorry. All right, I'll go ahead. I think just very briefly, I think absolutely agree, Barbara. But it's taking the time to understand what's important to women. And again, I harp on about it, not one size fits all approach, and making an assumption about what I need is different to what Barbara needs, is different to what Sunny needs. And it's about being inclusive with that approach. Just as an example, are meetings all virtual or are they in person? Now that we work in a hybrid model, do we involve people just through a screen, or do we involve people face to face? Let's be aware of what biases we have and what assumptions we make, and just keep a regular conversation going and keep checking in with people.
Yeah, I would agree.
Sorry,
I think
Sunny, I cut in ahead of you there. Apologies.
No, not at all. No, I was, it's a really interesting piece around the hybrid working in terms of, just being cognizant of, sometimes I think people that are on video calls and people that are actually in person, and sometimes, people's voices get lost when they're in video calls. And so I read an article a couple of weeks ago around, having have a moderator typically in a meeting room helping you kind of, get people point across in a meeting, but having a moderator on the calls is actually also in video conference. So they're actually calling people out and bringing people forward. Because I think sometimes there's a little bit of a bias there. If you're a working parent and you happen to be, on video call where your colleagues are in the office, you might not have that same time of space to be able to have a voice. And so making sure that people are calling that out. But I think ultimately there's still not enough of us at the top, but it's imperative for those that we use our voices to create more seats and spaces for women in the future. And, I always say, rather than wait for a seat at the table, start your own table. So.
So we're at the end of our time, unfortunately, and I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. And if you have any additional questions for our panelists, you can find them on LinkedIn and social media. Sunny, Louise, Barbara, thank you again for joining us and sharing your incredible insights for International Women's Day. And I want to take just a moment to encourage any woman watching to actively invest in your self-development and be confident enough to put yourself forward. We've heard some great advice today, so let's go break the bias and celebrate our differences. I'm going to hand it back to Laura. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. As a woman leading an incredible team of all female rock stars who I hope were all listening, they'll be tested on the conversation later. That was an incredible discussion. I am sure we have all taken away a lot, and I really appreciated the candor and honest sharing from you all. Thank you so much. We don't end there. It's not the end of this afternoon. We have our incredible keynote coming up. For those of you who were around for the panel discussion, really, really hope you enjoyed that somewhat extraordinary conversation. It was fabulous. I was sitting there hard agreeing to a lot, scribbling stuff down. Would encourage you to reach out to some of those panelists. They've got fabulous insights to keep on sharing. And now we've got another treat for you. What a day we've had. Belinda Palmer, I'm not sure why you wouldn't know who she is, but I'm going to give you a quick intro anyway. She's a renowned keynote speaker, entrepreneur, campaigner, and corporate activist. Founder of the Empathy Business, a business that embeds empathy into companies. She's been published in the Harvard Business Review amongst many publications. She was awarded an OBE, that's an Order of the British Empire for the non-Brits on the call, for her services to women in technology. And she was also voted one of the top 20 global diversity figures in public life for, incredibly importantly, bridging the gap in representation of women in tech and STEM. In short, we can't really think of a better speaker for you today. One quick note, please do feel free to ask questions. We'd love this to be as interactive as possible. And we're sure that any points raised will be as applicable to other people as they are to you. But without further ado, over to you, Belinda.
Thanks, Laura. I loved your introduction. God, I could take you to every event. So it's really good to be here. I wish that I was in the same room as you all, but obviously that's not possible, because that would be, if we were together, it would release oxytocin, and oxytocin is the empathy or bonding hormone. But hopefully I'm going to see you all in person soon. And I want to thank the amazing team at Bullhorn for actually putting this event together. So Erin, Anna and Laura and lots of others, because they've put a lot of empathy and effort into the session. So thank you. And as Laura said, please put the questions in the chat. Makes it much more interesting. I'm going to chat for about 20 minutes and then take questions. So looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. In terms of who I am the CEO of the Empathy Business, but what that really means is we're a bit like company doctors. So we go into big companies and we identify their empathy strengths and deficits. So not at an individual level, at an organizational level. So that could be the leadership team, how that operates. That could be the way they communicate in meetings and emails, right through to the operations of the business and how the call advisors pick up the phone. And my vision is really to transform the world of work and make it more empathic. And I think that particularly now with what's going on in the world, you know, the world seems very unempathic. And I think we need empathy more than we've ever needed it. And we need it in the context of work. And I know in the panel, they talked a lot about courage. And it's really interesting because people don't associate courage and empathy. And actually, empathy is being courageous. It is about having those difficult conversations. You know, if I like you, and I'm sure I do, but if I like you, it's really easy for me to show you empathy. Or if we've got something in common, we've both got teenagers, or I've had a really good sleep. Yeah, I'm massively affected by sleep. But then it's easy for me to show empathy, but it's difficult to show empathy when you're having one of those difficult conversations. So empathy and courage really go together, and it's about owning conflict. And one of the things I want to talk about is the difference between empathy and sympathy. So today I'm going to share some slides, hopefully, if this works. Can you all see my screen? How do I go to presenter mode? Set up. Yeah, hopefully you can all see my screen. Yes?
Yes.
You can. Okay, brilliant. I just got to do a slideshow now. One sec. Okay. Set up slideshow. No. Okay, there's always one technical hitch, isn't there? Use presenter view. Okay, well, we're just going to see them like this then. View, let me just do view. Okay, slideshow from the beginning. Here we go. And I do look at women in tech, so that's embarrassing just to have a technical hitch. But anyway, so the key point I want to make is that empathy accepts friction. And if we have time at the end, I'll just tell you something that happened to me today with a member of my team where I really had to show empathy because I'd kind of messed up. So I wanted to chat to you about that a bit more if we have time. So in the session today, I want to talk about the context of now, how we've experienced the pandemic and the impact. I want to talk about some of the myths around empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. And I want to show you some very tangible, practical examples of how you can start to implement empathy in your own organization. And these are things I call empathy nudges. So there's small things that in aggregate will create an empathy revolution in your organization. It's a really glimpse, you know, there's lots of theory, there's lots of science around empathy, but I'm not going to go into because we just haven't got the time. But I do want to define empathy. So the way that we define empathy is the emotional impact the company has on its colleagues and clients. And it's really important because it's a bit like if my son is misbehaving at school, it's often because there's a problem internally at home. And we see that a lot in companies, that there's be something in the internal culture. It might be a fear culture. It might be incredibly hierarchical or a culture that puts process over people. And that will come out with customers. So we look at empathy across both. And if we define empathy in the kind of theoretical sense, there's three types of empathy. So there's your cognitive empathy, that's your head. So essentially, that's what the psychopaths are really good at. They are really good at understanding what motivates you. That's what level one we think of that. Affective empathy is what we call emotional empathy. So that's if, you know, Laura says something really sad, my mirror tells me a sad story, my mirror neurons, and I will feel pain in the same way. I will respond to Laura's pain. And the third level of empathy, which is what I'm really interested in, is behavioral empathy. This is about being motivated to act, what we call empathy in action. And what we do is we've got a model, I won't go into it now, but essentially we look at things like belonging. So at the heart of an empathic organization is the feeling that you belong, that you are visible, that your voice counts. And so we look at different ways and we almost, it's weird, but we almost institutionalize empathy. So we take quite an analytical approach to empathy because otherwise it's just one of these vague concepts and people think empathy is, you know, bringing your dog to the Zoom call. My dog is here, by the way. So that's how we kind of define empathy and measure it, and you can measure it. But in the context of now, I want to think about empathy and what we've all been through. So everyone on this call has experienced the pandemic differently. But one of the things I'm seeing in the engagement surveys and feedback from colleagues is actually a word to describe. Many people at work are feeling battered. I mean, 60% of us are suffering emotional burnout right now. And burnout is now recognized by the World Health Organization. It is when you feel exhausted at the thought of the day, at the beginning of the day. The Harvard Business Review have said that 89% of us during the pandemic feel that our mental health has gone down. So you've got a context of people feeling battered. And I think the other thing, and that's really important for you as leaders, for you as team members, because you have to manage people's emotions or acknowledge them in a way that we never had to do before. We've also got Gen Z coming in. So Gen Z have come in, a study was done by Deco a couple of weeks ago. And what it said is the number one thing Gen Z want from their workplace is to feel valued, to feel recognized. And ultimately, it's not only about money anymore. For my generation, it was about job security. But for this generation, they're demanding that their leaders can recognize them and have emotional intelligence. And I think we saw that play out with the CEO of KPMG during COVID, when he was on a call like this and basically said to his employees, stop moaning, forget about it, don't be a victim and get on with it. And he subsequently had to resign. So I guess what I'm saying to you is whatever you're thinking about in your own organization, is the context of now is so important, because people are demanding empathy. People are demanding that you show emotional intelligence. And the three most important questions you can ask right now is, do you feel visible? Do you feel cared for? And do you know what your purpose is? And this is not about an annual engagement survey. This is about doing this every 2 weeks or every month or every week, but really checking in to see how each other feels. It's so important. And I think what's brilliant about now is what we're finding, and I work for generally large banks, energy companies, tech companies, is there is an opportunity to reset. And the fact that you're on this call, the fact that you're thinking about empathy, about breaking the bias, about improving your company culture and your role within that is great, because people are more open in times of crisis. I wanted to go through some of the myths around empathy. And we talked a bit about empathy kind of being paired with courage and people not necessarily associating that. The myth that I see in all companies at CEO level is often they will confuse sympathy for empathy. And I'm going to show you, Anna's going to share, we're going to share a video in a minute, just so you can see what we really mean by this. But sympathy is a pity party. So if Indy tells me a sad story, it's me saying, oh, Indy, I'm really sad for you. Is that helpful? Does that help her? Empathy is about saying, okay, there's an issue. I'm here to support you. It's rolling up your sleeves and saying, okay, I'm going to support you, but ultimately you are accountable. And I think it's really important we see, particularly in larger organizations, is this parent-child culture where sympathy becomes this pity party, and that's not good for anyone. And I want to show you some examples of that. It's also interesting to look at the word empathy. So the word empathy is a German word, and it means feeling in. And sympathy is feeling about. There's always a detachment to the subject. So I'm just going to share now that we've got a little video. It's only a couple of minutes. It's really good. Brené Brown, some of you might have seen it before. I'm going to share with you a video on empathy. Oh, hopefully we can play.
I think it's coming, Belinda. We're just getting it to stop buffering.
Oh, okay, no worries.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar. who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, great. Oops, yes, you can hear me now. Yes?
Yes, all good.
Oops.
And the dogs.
And the dog. I said it wasn't about bringing a dog onto the dog call. 1 sec. Whiskey, stop. Okay, right. So the second myth I want to talk about is that empathy. I'm going to let my dog out. Excuse me. Whiskey, stop it. Okay. The joys of online speeches. Okay, the second myth is that empathy is a commercial trade-off. I get this all the time. More empathic companies make more money. Laura mentioned the Harvard Business Review study we did. We looked at lots of different companies. More empathic companies have higher growth, higher earnings, higher productivity. Catalyst, and I can share this research with you, Catalyst did a recent study which shows the power of empathy in times of crisis. We've got a 77% link to engagement, lower burnout, and most importantly, and relevant to the panel discussion that you've had, is it increases belonging. It's off the scale with more empathic leadership. So we've got the stats, we know that it works, and we also know, to my earlier point, is when people demand it. The other thing is people, sometimes I work with leaders and they say, oh, you know what, I'm just not empathic, or I'm an engineer, or I'm a techie, we don't do empathy. And it's a myth. So the research shows that about 50% of your empathic capabilities is what you're born with. But the rest of it is up for grabs. It's your environment, it's about practicing it, it's about whether you're rewarded for it. And What's interesting is none of us on this call are getting any smarter in terms of IQ. So our IQ is pretty fixed by the age of about 24. Or IQ, actually, I don't know if anyone is under 24 on this call. So that was a bias. But our IQ is fixed about 24. Our EQ is malleable. And Daniel Goleman, if you're interested in this, has done a lot of work about people now, leaders with an IQ of 100, managing people with an IQ of 160. So emotional intelligence is what's going to get you to the top. And I think we're slowly realizing that. But what does that look like? I want to show you some of the examples. I want to finish and show you some of the examples. I've seen some of the questions in the chat, so I want to get to the questions. But I want to show you, what does it really look like? How does it translate into action? Language is one of the most important tools that we have. This was something we were working on with the UK government. You'll recognise them on the left, very much fear-based. And this is the parent-child. You know, this works in as a leader for a very short time. But ultimately, what we said is you've got to do three things. You've got to recognise the sacrifice people are making. You've got to really acknowledge that it's making a difference. And secondly, you've got to start small. And that's the thing with these empathy nudges. You can start small. And it really is important. Like one company I was working with, you know, they just keep using sort of words that dehumanize people. Cascade. I mean, who wakes up in the morning and wants to be cascaded to? Dial up, mobilize, socialize. These are very passive words. And part of that is looking at your signage. So I want you to really start thinking about, what is the language that you're using? Is it empathic? Is it dehumanizing? Because language shapes our behavior and our thinking. In one company, in one bank, we did 42 nudges. And one of the things we changed was the word head office. So the people in head office, there was a big empathy gulf between those in head office and those in branch. So changing it to support hub. You know, Disney don't call their receptionists, they call them director of first impressions. And I think I mentioned this sort of, so one is language. The other thing is these difficult conversations. It's really important that you start having those. This was something we did for Direct Energy in the States, where we rewrote 100 of their letters and said, right, okay, at the moment, people don't really know what you're saying. And we wrote some really difficult messages. You know, you've got 30 days to pay or we'll disconnect you. And they're very, you know, people would say, well, that's not very empathic. But ultimately, if you're getting disconnected, you need to know about it. And it goes back to this empathy is not sympathy. We saw customer satisfaction go up and also the recovery of debt to the business. We did a difficult conversations toolkit, and this is really important because actually as a company, you know, most companies, a lot of large companies we work with, only about 20 to 25% of people feel psychologically safe to speak up. It's so important that you symbolize, actually, we can have a difficult conversation. This is how we do it. And there's lots of tips and tricks you can do about setting expectations, using emotional labeling to actually make that a better conversation. The worst thing you can do is avoid it, which is going to be very stereotypical. Us Brits are terrible at having difficult conversations. This was something we did, which was really interesting, actually. This was meeting cards, because a lot of the time we spend is in meetings, and about 70% of meetings they think are just about reinforcing the status quo rather than moving the business forward. So we created these meeting cards. This one, Cut the Crap, was a famous one by the former CEO of the BBC, because as he got to the top, people would just tell him what he wanted to hear. So we did what's the elephant in the room. You can do them around gender, making sure that the introverts have a space. Online, you can use collaborative tools. There's man interruption. You can look at who's interrupting who. There's so many tools you can do. But if you really want to change your culture fast, meetings are a fantastic way to do that. And then the other thing is really thinking about in your own company, does people come above process? Because I see that process usurps people so often and people just get lost. One of the things we did for one company was actually, we found this was a financial company, that when customers walk in, they would say, oh, you know, the computer says no. And we asked them one question: what would you do if it was a member of your family? And what we did is we monitored all the transactions over 3 months. This one question brought much more humanity, increased NPS and customer satisfaction, and didn't cause any loss of income. This is something that Indeed recruitment company do, which I love. Is what they do is they, in every corporate room, in every meeting room, they have a chair which is for the applicant, the job applicant. So they're constantly reminding themselves, who are they serving? I think one of the CEOs we worked with, what he did was he sent out an email once a month to people that had delivered the values. So it took him, less than an hour. People would nominate other people and say how they delivered the values. And he would to get an email from the CEO of a 70,000 employee company was pretty impressive. It cost the business nothing. This was something I saw the other day, just relevant to breaking the bias. I'll just let you have a quick read of that. And then I'll take some questions. I just thought that was a really clever way. So, to kind of say, in terms of the sort of final thoughts, when you're thinking about empathy in leadership in your own world, make it tangible. Focus on things like the job ads, the language, the recruitment processes, the call scripts. Relook at them through the lens of empathy. Think about, does it put people over process? Because the process is a means to an end. And the final thing is really start small. Change something today. Commit to an empathy nudge. Share it with someone. We know the act of writing it down. We know the act of sharing an empathy nudge increases the likelihood of it happening by 30%. So start small, change something today, and let the empathy revolution begin. Anyway, I would love to take some of your questions.
Thanks so much, Belinda. Some incredible examples there. Some questions coming in, and we've got more, I'm sure, as we go through this discussion. First one, as a team member, how can you show empathy day to day over Zoom beyond the basic, how are you?
It's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is, for at least part of the meeting, having your camera on, because that does release oxytocin. So that will definitely create a sense of presence. I think the second thing is using the collaborative software out there to look at who's getting the airtime, because what I see in meetings is the same old people speak. So actually going back to whoever's running the meeting, if you're running the meeting, say, I just thought we'd take the last 3 meetings and look at, who the airtime that people got. So I think actually measuring who's getting the airtime and making sure it's not the same old people is really important. The third thing is the introvert. So what we see often in meetings is the introverts don't have a voice. So I would make sure that, if someone hasn't spoken, just to include them, like it might be, okay, haven't heard about your thoughts yet, Laura. So making sure the introverts get a space. And the final thing is this emotional measurement. These 3 key questions. Do you feel visible? Do you feel cared for? And do you know what your purpose is? And that last one, so you can do that anonymously, you can do that, directly, but those 3 questions will really give you an emotional barometer of how people feel. And they might not want to tell you that face to face. So the benefit of a screen could really help. So hopefully that's some of the things.
We had a great next question. How do you effectively, I know this is a corker, thank you, Maiken. How do you effectively manage or engage in a relationship with someone who doesn't show a lot of empathy towards you?
Oh, Maiken, did you say that was? Maiken, I'd love it if you could tell us who that was. Just kidding. So I think, if somebody doesn't, so for me, the main thing I see, and I work with CEOs of big companies, is not the amount of empathy they've got, is their self-awareness. The biggest differentiator is self-awareness, because it doesn't matter if they haven't got a lot of empathy, but if they're not self-aware and they don't give a monkeys, then that's more difficult. But if they are self-aware, I think you can work with that. So how do you deal with someone who hasn't got much empathy? Well, I think that's another speech. No, I'm just kidding.
Maiken, your question was too big.
No, it was a really good question. I think, how do you deal with someone that hasn't got much empathy? Well, I think firstly is finding out, is it that they have difficulty in expressing their emotions, or is it that they don't want to, they're not open to this? So I sometimes see with tech people at a particular company I was working with, they were just not interested, the developers were not interested in empathy as the way that I was described, as I was using it. But then when I talked about, okay, the user experience, and actually I gave them concrete, tangible examples of how empathy can help, they were a little bit more interested. So you might want to think think about ways to make empathy tangible and relevant. It could be the commercial case. So hopefully in these slides, you've got a bit of the commercial case that it can make you money. So that often works. So really understanding the reason behind that person who doesn't have empathy.
And you mentioned there kind of developers not loving the empathic approach. In your work across all of those industries that you've mentioned, do you see particular segments where it's harder or easier to engage with this as an approach?
Well, this is interesting because you'd think that actually some of the more let's say kind of consumer brands or sexy brands would be much better at this. They're not. I think the first thing is we're all work in progress. So the day a company says we're empathic enough, or the day any of us on this call say we're empathic enough, is the day we stop being empathic. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing goes back to that self-awareness. It's actually about people that care. And I work with a lot of engineers, but the issue is when they say, look, I'm not very good at it, but I want to do it. Can you help? The other thing is always start small and start tangible. And language is a great place to start. It's a lot less scary. It's quite tangible. And people seem to use that to almost as a catalyst for an empathy revolution.
Oh, thank you, Emily. Emily is a Bullhorn colleague. She's also in control of our social media today, so thank you for that, Emily. But what's an example of behaviour someone might think is empathic but is actually unempathetic?
Oh, that's good, and it's quite individual. I know that where I used to, the company that I used to work with, my boss used to call me by my surname. So I'd walk down there and go, Palmer. And that's quite, for the non-Brits here, it's quite a public school thing, you know, and I didn't go to a public school. I went to a state school. I'm from Essex. So we didn't call each other by our surnames. So I think that for me was an example of using your own reference. And I think where people get it wrong is people say, oh, treat people as you want to be treated. That's not good enough. That's not empathy, because that's me as the frame of reference. And I'll just quickly tell you what happened to me this morning. So one of my team members, she is Hungarian. And anyway, we communicate on WhatsApp. And I said, oh, hi, can you do help me with this? Actually, it was changes to these slides. So it was all a bit last minute. And she said, yes, I can. She said, but I'd really like it if you could capitalize my name, because in my country, it's disrespectful. And I was just like, oh my God, I did not know that. So I think you're never going to know. You're never going to know, but you've got to create a space where people feel safe enough to tell you. Yeah. And that's my main learning, that you can't know, you can never be so empathic, not even Mrs. Doubtfire, is that, you can never be that empathic that you're always going to get it right. We're human, we're flawed, but create the safe spaces where people can call it out, because I felt terrible, but I'm going to make sure that I never do that again.
I think one of the common themes that I've heard as an attendee listening to all of the speakers is it's really individual centered. So all of the things we've been talking about is really about asking great questions and understanding your people. That's kind of the theme that's run through the whole day. Another question for you.
Yes, one second, my Alexa is going off now. Right. Oh, I bet your other speakers were way more professional than me.
I had explained to all the speakers earlier on that I had to feed my cat, so she didn't do the same thing as your dog did. Such is the change in the world over the last 2 years. We've got a lot of participants on the call today from a range of cultures and locations and a range of kind of differing experiences. But if they were to wake up tomorrow and you were to give them one kind of nugget of advice that they can implement tomorrow to really be more empathic in the workplace, what advice would you give them?
I think change. So I would give them a couple of pieces. One is focus on meetings. Meetings are a great way to show empathy, but also change the internal culture. So 70% of our time is spent in meetings. So one is change meetings. Secondly, start with language. Play unempathic bingo. Find out because in every person's company, so of all the people on this call, they will all have their own kind of favorite, bullshit bingo phrases that we all have. So find, play that, understand, focus on language, try and change a couple of things. But the third thing is you've got to measure it. You can't manage what you can't manage what you don't measure. And we know that with our Fitbit steps. So you've got to start measuring things like empathy, a sense of belonging. Do people feel cared for? So start measuring it, holding up the mirror to yourself, and start small. Fabulous.
Guys that are on the call, are there any other questions for Belinda? We don't often have somebody of such great stature on the call, so I'd love it if any more are going to come in. We've just got probably 20 seconds before brilliant. How can managers get better at leading teams where empathetic people coexist with highly competitive folks that quickly decrease their empathy level once a goal is in sight? That's a great question. Thank you, Mariana. Do you want me to repeat that one?
Well, no, I think it's interesting because I would say highly competitive people can be incredibly empathic. I really would. So I would say, I think sometimes, again, we think showing empathy is nice. It's the nice people who show empathy and everyone else just gets on with the business. So I would challenge that question in an empathic way, hopefully. But so challenge the question. And I think the key thing is this purpose. So always find something that we agree on. So, our common purpose is to improve the tech, the way that people recruit in the tech industry. So I think focusing on purpose right now, because people need anchors. They're feeling very destabilized about job security, about illness, family relatives. There are so many layers of stress right now that you have to give people anchors. And one of those anchors, whether you're highly competitive or not, is why are we here? What are we doing? And keep reiterating the purpose of this meeting, the purpose of this project. This is what I need from you. And be very clear about your expectations. And I think your expectations might vary slightly with different people and different personalities, but ultimately your common goal is to get the work done and get it done brilliantly.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you to all those people who submitted questions. There were some great questions there, and thank you to Belinda and to Indy and to all of our incredible panelists. I said right at the start that this is my favorite day of the year, and I remain of that opinion. It's such an incredible, insightful journey that we go on with these women in recruitment events. On behalf of the whole Bullhorn team, I also just want to say a quick thank you to Anna, who many of you know for all her hard work behind the scenes, and there is a lot to pull together an event like this. But we hope you found today as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. We very much look forward to seeing you at a Women in Recruitment event soon, and wish you all a good day or a good evening, wherever you might be in the world. See you again soon. Take care.